My name is Rhoda Reddock, and I was born in a small Caribbean island called St. Vincent. I grew up in a slightly larger one, actually two island state, Trinidad and Tobago. My mother was from Trinidad, and we moved back there when I was 7 years old. So I am a Trinbagonian, which is the popular term for citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. I am currently Professor Emerita of the University of the West Indies St. Augustine Campus in Trinidad and Tobago. And the University of the West Indies serves 17 Caribbean countries in the English-speaking Caribbean. I worked first in a research institute, the Institute for Social and Economic Research, then at the Department of Sociology. But as a feminist sociologist, I was very much involved in the work for the establishment of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, an interdisciplinary program in women and gender studies within the university. When that institute was established, I then moved from the Department of Sociology as the first head of the IGDS at the UWI St. Augustine campus. There are other campus units in Jamaica and Barbados, and a regional coordinating office in the Vice Chancellery or the University Center at the Mona, Jamaica campus. My areas of interest have been extremely diverse and interdisciplinary. So I'm a kind of undisciplined sociologist, so to speak. However, my work has always tended to be feminist and intersectional, with these questions and approaches characterizing most of what I do. My work also tends to be historically based, and my areas of interest have included women's labor and social movement history, for example, women's labor history, Caribbean feminist movements, women and Pan-Africanism, Indo-Caribbean women, radical Caribbean feminists and social thought, gender, ethnicity, identity and citizenship, gender and sexualities, theorizing manhood and masculinities, and I've also done a lot of feminist theoretical work, as well as gender, environment, and natural resource use. Now, the IGDS is an interdisciplinary unit, and therefore I've been able to collaborate with scholars in various disciplines and experience wonderful and innovative research collaborations. For example, I've worked with plant pathologists, geologists, agriculturists, medical scientists, historians, etc. And I've published so far 8 books. I have one more forthcoming in March 2021, 2 self-authored and 6 edited volumes. I also have over 70 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and I'm currently working on a long-suffering self-authored book manuscript. And I also still have a number of outstanding manuscripts to complete. So you can see that I'm still very busy. From very early, I had interest in people and social justice. I recall while still at high school, going to the entrance of the prison in my capital city and asking how I could visit. I was told of all the requirements that would be necessary, and so I shelved the idea. I knew that I wanted to be involved in social change and to impact people's lives, but I also knew that I did not have the temperament for the in-depth, individualized, personalized work required of a social worker. Somehow at that time though, I still thought that sociology was too distant and I wanted something more applied. So I did my first degree at the University of the West Indies, first year on the Trinidad and Tobago campus at St. Augustine, and then the other years in Jamaica. During what I call the glorious 70s, it was a period of a lot of political change, a period of the emergence of feminism, the Black Power movement. So it was great to be around at that time. I did my degree in social administration, which is something that's no longer offered. I did the basic sociological courses, sociological theory, methods, statistics. However, I also did subjects related to the administration of the social services, and I spent an entire year studying two prisons in Jamaica, one a maximum security and the other a minimum security prison. I remember at one time near the end of my research period, there was a prison riot in the maximum security facility. And I was found to have been taking reading material into the prisons, some of it perceived as radical political stuff. So for a few weeks, I was banned from going back to the prison, but then I was allowed again under stringent conditions. Now, as a result, my very first publication was even before I went to graduate school. It was called Prison Education in Jamaica, published in 1979. When I read it again, as I did recently, I'm really embarrassed at its simplicity. In relation to graduate studies, I attended the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague, part of the Dutch system of international education. There were students there from virtually every part of the world. I didn't have a scholarship and I had planned to use my savings, but our currency devalued just before I left, so I got into financial difficulties. When the Dutch aliens police threatened to send me back home, I was able to get a small monthly allowance, and the ISS put me in student accommodation, the smallest room possible. Normally, there's no student accommodation for master's students, but they found somewhere to put me. This allowed me to get my aliens residency and to complete my master's degree. Now, at further graduate level, I still wanted to do a more applied degree. So I did an interdisciplinary master's in development studies, where I did courses in development economics, social planning, politics of development, labor studies, etc. So all of this broadened my experience in many ways, and provided me with skills and knowledge in a wide range of areas relevant to the situation of post-colonial countries and the challenges of development. My master's specialization was in comparative development studies, and it was here that I was introduced to feminist and women's studies as an academic area. I was in the two pioneer classes on women and development introduced at the ISS during my first period there. On completion of my master's degree, I joined the doctoral program at the University of Amsterdam, for the first time in my life with a fellowship from the ISS. I worked with German sociologist Maria Mies and Dutch anthropologist G. Cryer. I continued to be based at the ISS and was involved in teaching and supervising master's students. That degree was in applied sociology, which is really where I would say my scholarship lies. Specifically, it was a labor and political history of women and women's work in Trinidad and Tobago, published as Women, Labor and Politics in Trinidad and Tobago, a history by Z Books, London. Maria Mies, my supervisor, was a very important influence in my academic life and my life generally, in that she reinforced my emerging trajectory towards becoming a scholar activist and a public intellectual. She always used to quote to me that quotation from Marx, philosophers have interpreted the world, the point, however, is to change it. So, on completing my doctorate, I was offered two visiting positions, one semester each, one at Binghamton, SUNY, and the other at the ISS. And I was very excited at the possibility of flying around the world. And I was telling this to Maria, and she said to me, "You will do no such thing. You will return to your country and build something." So I said, "Okay," and I did. I was very lucky to get a research fellow position immediately on completion of my degree. So I returned home to a job. I was research fellow at the then Institute for Social and Economic Research. Uh, and as a research fellow, I did not have teaching responsibilities, except for those I voluntarily accepted. So I had the opportunity and the time to begin writing, to continue involvement in some of my ISS research projects, etc., etc. And a core focus of the ISA was on demographic research. Now, this had not been an area of interest or experience for me. And I actually looked down on it a bit at first because I felt, they were not very theoretical or conceptual, the arrogance of youth. And this time, a UWI senior mentor, Lucille Matherin, may advised me. She said, "Rhoda, look at this positively. This is an opportunity to learn new skills." And I did acquire skills in demographic analysis, understanding about censuses and surveys, and I grew to respect, although also to challenge, my senior colleagues. So I think the lesson here is that there are lots of new learning that can happen after we enter the real world. Now, in Europe, I had developed a lot of connections and possibilities. I'd already traveled to India, Senegal, and other parts of Europe. So I was fortunate to begin my career with opportunities for involvement in global research projects, invitations to attend conferences, and even though I was in Trinidad and Tobago, my international connections continued and they were extremely important. I also joined professional organizations, and the ISA, of course, was a very important one. But I also joined the Caribbean Studies Association, the Latin American Studies Association, the American Sociological Association, and I was invited to join the International Women's Anthropology Conference, which was set up in the US. And with global connections, these were really important for me in the development of my career. I attended my first ISA conference in Madrid in 1990, but I had heard of RC32 before I heard of the ISA. I recall one of my ISS academic colleagues, Rene Pittin, asking me, "Rhoda, you are not a member of RC32?" As if, how could you be a feminist sociologist and not be a member of RC32? RC32 was clearly where it was happening at that time. And when I look back at the list of membership, which I did recently, it's a veritable who's who of early second wave feminist sociologists, most from the north, but also quite a few from the south. RC32 always made a special effort to be diverse, and that is why I felt comfortable there. I recall traveling from Trinidad via Amsterdam to Madrid, then realizing on the way that I did not have a visa for Spain. My session chair, Carrie Marias, who had invited me, spent the entire day in Madrid arranging for me to be allowed to enter the country. I remember that was a very dicey moment then. And that was my first full ISA conference. And to my shock, near the end, I was approached by two senior sociologists, women sociologists, Veena Mazumdar and Neera Desai at India, asking me if I was willing to be nominated for the position of RC32 chair-elect and then to assume the position of chair in 1994. That was a shock to me as I was new to the organization. But then I worked with the new chair, Linda Christensen Ruffman, and took up my position as president of RC32 in 1994. Many of my earliest publications began while still at graduate school. Some of them continue to be some of the most important journal publications that I have. They drew on my doctoral research, even prior to completing my degree, while others were responses to specific requests and calls. I think one even came from a master's course paper. Now, as I mentioned before, when I returned home, those connections that I had provided these opportunities for conference presentations, but also for publishing. But I also made new connections and responded to regional and local calls. And this is important. I soon realized that much of my internationally published work was not easily available locally. Those were in the days before we had online databases. So I made a conscious decision to publish in both international and regional journals and to use both international and regional presses. And I think that was very important because to me, my audience was global but also local. In relation to funding for research, I think this is a very important question, especially for those of us based in the global south. There are no national funding bodies. We have to compete for research funds by our institutions, and we often don't qualify for international funding as many of countries in the Caribbean are not B or C countries. And the Caribbean has small populations, and therefore we end up between a rock and a hard place as we don't often qualify for funds available to low-income countries. In many instances, funds for dissertation research itself is limited. Many of my graduate students have full-time jobs, so it is extremely difficult for them. And this is where global collaborations come in. We have to work with colleagues in other countries to access larger grants. Supervisors and mentors also have to assist through their networks, providing opportunities for their students to get funding or access into other universities. So for us, there's a lot of work in mentoring and supporting our students and also accessing research funds. So many publishing opportunities also occur at conferences, and therefore sometimes you make an excellent conference presentation or intervention at a session, which makes others aware of your work and can lead to invitations of various kinds. So for example, someone who works in your area may then realize that you are working in a similar area. So conferences are great ways to learn, to know what is current, to get exposure to new ideas. And please resist the urge to present your paper and then hive off to see the sights or to go shopping. Plan your schedule to include conference activities and recreation. Social activities are also important for making those academic connections. It's also important to stay up to date with information from professional organizations. For example, the newspapers, for example, the ISA Gram, that may advertise grants, calls for research, postdoc opportunities, etc. It is important to understand how the system works at your institution and in the international academic world generally, but don't narrowly conform to it. For example, don't adjust what you do simply because you feel that is what will get you through. Write on this topic because it's the flavor of the month. Don't develop a rote style of writing because you have been told that this is what is required to get published. So while you may need to conform to certain standards or various aspects of what exists, you also have the opportunity to expand the boundaries, to question orthodoxies, to get into new and exciting areas, and to try new approaches and methodologies. But to do this often requires more work, more creativity, deeper reading, and engagement with the subject matter and a willingness to end up somewhere that you never considered when you began. In the end, the value of your work will be recognized. It is also important to do work that is necessary and needed. So, in addition to our interests, our expand, the interesting and creative things that we do, it is also important to do things that are necessary. For example, one of the things that I did was to pull together a number of classic readings in sociology in the text Caribbean Sociology Introductory Readings. I used to teach Introduction to Sociology. I know some of us have that pleasure, to up to between 300 and 400 students. The main textbooks were British and North American, and then the students had to fight in the library for the Caribbean readings. It was based on that I decided that we needed a collection of classic and contemporary readings in Caribbean sociology. And that publication established a canon of Caribbean sociological thought. And although there's a lot of new work since then, those classic pieces and the introductions to those fields have become an important body of knowledge on Caribbean sociology. Now that collection is available in libraries worldwide. It's used in high schools and universities throughout the region. So I think sometimes we have to do the work we like, we have to do the work that is important, and we have to do the work that breaks new boundaries. Now, my work, as I mentioned earlier, has been very interdisciplinary. So I do have many areas and sub-areas of interest. I did receive the advice to stick to one or two areas and develop a solid body of work. But I was also interested in so many things and would get excited when presented with the possibility of working in a particular area. And of course, this is one of my difficulties. This could lead to overcommitment and burnout. So it's good advice to thread carefully. I think my choice of subject areas were also affected by my concerns, what I thought needed to be changed in the world or in my society or region. But I was also willing to engage with new and exciting areas of work. As a result, I pioneered writing in a number of key areas regionally and internationally. For example, when I wrote my Women's Social and Labor and Political History, I recall some of my local professors wondering what that was and if it was actually possible to do so. Similarly, many years later, when I hosted the first regional conference on men and masculinities in 1996, I recall people actually laughing at the idea. And for years, I was unable to get the volume coming out of the conference published. Even male editors internationally were perplexed. It was eventually published, and I'm proud to say this, by my university press, and it actually became a bestseller and it actually received a best-selling textbook award. Subsequent to that, some of those same publishers have now published global series on men and masculinities. So it is also interesting being part of multidisciplinary research projects. For example, I was involved in a project on an endangered wetland in my country where the co-investigator was a plant pathologist, and the research team included an economist, an agricultural scientist, an ecologist, an animal scientist, and a political scientist. We learned a great deal from each other. We had lively debates on the question, what is research? For those scientists, they had one idea of research, but I think they also learned a lot in the process, and the study generated important findings. The pandemic provided different challenges and opportunities. Travel still is not possible in most cases, and we have all had to adapt to Zoom, etc. I, for one, am totally zoomed out, and I can't wait for this to end, if it ever will. It did, however, provide a time for reflection. Working at home, especially during the lockdown, allowed for the completion of some of my unfinished writing projects. However, I know that for many, online teaching provided additional stress. Some used it as an opportunity to shift their research interests a bit and to write on the pandemic and its effects. And as a result, a whole number of useful analyses and publications have emerged. So the issue is therefore, when we encounter situations or challenges like this, we need to sit down, evaluate the situation, and chart a new course to make it work despite the challenges. Looking back at my journey, I don't think I would have done much differently. Perhaps I would have tried to be more organized. I really envy people who have organized workspaces, who are always well prepared, who never miss deadlines, but I'm still working on this. Sometimes I wonder if I should have gone into senior university management, which I did for 9 years at the end of my term. It seriously affected my book publications, and it definitely increased my stress levels. At the same time, it allowed me to use my sociological knowledge to shape university policy. I was surrounded by a sea of engineers. Most of the senior university managers were engineers who had little understanding of the social. At a time in history when the social was being actively undermined, is being actively undermined. It was a major struggle working in this context. But among other things, I feel that I left the campus with a stronger student support services division. I was able to make interventions on behalf of LGBTI students, and I left the university with a sexual harassment policy. As I mentioned earlier, in this neoliberal period, there's been significant decline in the importance of the social. For example, the importance of sociological analysis, social interventions, social policy, social psychological support systems, and the expenditure that should go along with this. In many parts of the world, sociology departments, as well as women's and gender studies programs, are under attack. Student numbers have been declining in sociology programs, and for many, sociological knowledge is irrelevant at best, in that it brings no apparent economic result, or dangerous at worst. As emerging sociologists and social scientists, I think it's important to commit to re-establishing the social as central to global analysis, national policy, and education at all levels. We must excite our students with the intellectual power of the social and sociological analysis to better understand the complexities of our world and to use this as a basis for transforming it. The decolonization of sociology is still on the table. The unequal structures of global knowledge production, dissemination, and consumption must be critically analyzed and addressed. The research and writing produced by scholars in the global south must be seen as globally relevant. Unfortunately, it is still seen as provincial. So in the same way that we in the south draw on the work of scholars in the global north, whose research is often also geographically situated, scholars in the north can learn about our work, read our work, put it on their reading list, and engage with us intellectually. Finally, in this COVID-19 and hopefully the post-COVID-19 era, where underlying social and gender inequalities and the monopolies of global supply chains have been exposed for all of us to see, It is the responsibility of all of us to reinsert the consciousness of the social, and to bring people and their complex realities back into the conversation on global futures and the agenda for recovery. Thank you.